class. This is Professor Jeff. Welcome back. We are now going to cover some applications of what we have been learning with Lesson 10. So strap in. This video will be pretty short and we'll have some few things to learn here. So getting into the contract itself, let's get a little refresher of what we have talked about in terms of technical contract elements, the ones that we've been using versus the legal elements, which is what the attorneys tend to use. So if you were to line up these terms that you see on the left side with those terms that are on the right side of this slide, how would you define these items? Well, let's kind of go through some of the easier parts of this first. So we all know that a signed contract is the final consummation of an agreement. So we would line those terms up. Now, when it comes to the cost, we obviously have learned in prior lessons that the cost is another word for consideration. So the question is how do we line up the remaining three? And I would suggest that we line them up in terms of the order by which they proceed. Now, a request for proposal or a scope of work could be the first item that we do. And when it finally gets down to a proposal, which is just prior to the agreement, would clearly be the last step. So if we were to line up these terms, this could be a way that we would do it. So as we said, the scope could be the offer if it's done prior to the request for proposal, and the request for proposal could be the counteroffer. I find that those could be interchangeable depending on the order by which the documents are developed. Cost, as we've said, is consideration. The signed contract lines up with the agreement, and then the proposal being the final stage is the acceptance of the offer. So these are just some things to keep in mind as we bounce between what we talk about as engineers for technical contract elements versus legal elements. Let's review some of the homework that you've had and see how we can best see how some of your answers should be coming along. In this homework, you had several documents to review, and you were asked to review certain things. Like among the 4 documents, you were to look for a standard of care. Now, where would the standard of care be found with the city of Rancho Palos Verdes, or RPV as we abbreviate here on the slide? And the way you'd want to answer it, very short, brief, to the point. Include your reference. Where do you find it? In this case, it's page 185, section 1.3. The schedule of work or our standard of care can be extrapolated from this. Remember what we've said in the past. Standard of care is not a section in the agreement. You got to read for what the inference is. But let's read it together. Consultant shall perform work with due diligence. That means just do it within a reasonable order of execution. But we also find that the service order in Exhibit A, page 195, says work described in words which so applied refer to such recognized standards. So it talks about the application of standards. When we talk about scope changes under the Bellevue contract, we find under page 180, the city may make changes. That doesn't sound reasonable, but what makes it more reasonable is the contractor's compensation will be modified accordingly. So there'll be adequate payment. It has to be negotiated. And then we find in terms of termination of a contract in the Bellevue contract, part B of question number 2, page 180, section 4.b, the contract may be terminated by either party without cause. Now, how do we know if this is heightened or not heightened? Well, let's go through and look at each one. Part 1, we would say it's not heightened. Why? Because it's recognized standards. Standards apply to everyone. It's not asking for above standard. It's not asking for first class manner or the best available. It's just saying recognized standards. So it's not heightened. When we look at part 2A, the contractor's compensation is going to be modified with those changes. It doesn't say how, it implies it'll be negotiated, so it's a reasonable and acceptable clause. And when we get to part 2B, we find that either party may terminate without cause. Now, without cause might sound kind of rough, but because either party has that ability to do so, it's considered reasonable and acceptable. So In class, not in this video presentation, we're going to go over a content context collaboration where we have a case study on selling of Canary Island palm trees. And so I'm going to ask you at the end of this video to then pick up the case study, review it. It's a fairly light level of reading. And then in class, we're going to analyze what went wrong with the case study and how we can try to correct it. And by the way, the case study is an actual condition that I ran into within one of the contracts I executed for one of our investment properties. So I hope you enjoy that. Now, class 2, if we were going to, the class exercise part 2A, if we were to do that in class, you would be asked. We have been asked to design a new engineering building on campus, provide the minimum necessary information needed for scope, cost, schedule, and contract terms and conditions. So we would break up into separate teams, and what would that look like? Well, our goal is to populate the table. So in the scope, we would define the building size, the floors, the number of classrooms, specialty rooms, and so on. The schedule would basically have the start date, the end date, when the building might be occupied, and that would be a framework for schedule. Under cost, we would want to have what the fee is. Maybe there's a fee structure for how that's broken up into pieces. And then when we get into contract terms and conditions, we would cover the fine details, such as payment terms, indemnification and liability, standard of care, dispute resolution, penalty clauses, insurance, and other requirements. So, the takeaways from the application part of this presentation is remember the leadership development plan that was covered in the first video. We're not going to test you on it, but this is just how you maintain some level of humility in your career by asking for feedback for how you can improve. We've talked about the legal elements of a contract, offer, acceptance, consideration, and legality, not to be confused with the features of a professional contract where we want to have scope, cost, schedule, terms and conditions. And your evaluation, if these things are heightened or ordinary. Remember, if the words high class or first class is stated, then it's heightened. If you think you didn't do it right on your homework, go back and refine it to make sure that if those terms are being used, do not say that, oh, that's reasonable that I should have first class work. And then understand what is industry reasonable or standard compliance, which is ordinary in terms of its application. And then when we get into the technical contract, we will then continue to look at the process elements as we talk about these things. So with that, catch you on lesson number 11.